What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here, back to review the new comedy Palm Springs, which dropped today on Hulu. Palm Springs stars Andy Samberg, Cristin, Milioti, if I'm saying that correctly, as well as the great JK Simmons. And it's basically a spiritual sequel to Groundhog Day. It's not a remake of Groundhog Day, but it's kind of a remake of Groundhog Day. But I totally get why screenwriter Andy Ciara and director Max Barbaco, who is making his feature film debut, I totally get why they'd be obsessed with the Bill Murray classic, because it's one of the funniest flicks of that decade. But if you've not seen Groundhog Day at this point, you might be asking, what the hell is Groundhog Day? What are you talking about? Basically, Palm Springs is a wedding movie. It's a romantic comedy where you have two characters who are stuck in this perpetual time loop where no matter what they were doing at the end of the day, they always wake up back in their bed at the beginning of the wedding day. Which means that the two lead characters, Niles and Sarah, can do whatever they want with their time, totally free of consequences. They can sleep with whoever they like, they can drink whatever they like, they can take whatever drugs they like, they can rob banks, they can commit suicide. It doesn't matter. They will always wake up back in their beds at the beginning of this wedding day. And I would say, on the whole, the movie is charming. It's not necessarily hysterical. There are a couple times where I found myself laughing out loud, or at least snickering out loud. There's really only one moment where I found myself just screaming with laughter. That said, there are not a lot of movies coming out right now, and if you're looking for just something that's easy and relaxing and enjoyable to watch, I do think Palm Springs delivers. And that's kind of a backhanded compliment where I say, oh, it's totally fine to watch right now during the coronavirus when we have no new movies coming out. But that's kind of the nicest thing I can say. I did enjoy it. It certainly has its moments, but there's a very good chance that I will never watch this movie ever again. And when you're talking about comedy, really good comedy, there's not a single comedy on the planet that I've enjoyed that I haven't rewatched endlessly. In the world of movies, I think comedy's in a really weird place right now where I don't know if there's ever been a weaker time for the genre than right now. And that could be due to a variety of reasons. Some say filmmakers are too cautious. Some people say the audiences are too sensitive. But I don't think that the shortcomings of this film that I perceive are a result of anything related to cancel culture. The shortcomings of the film are a result of this nauseating trap that so many comedies fall into, where about halfway or two-thirds of the way through the movie, they try to start taking their film seriously or becoming an actual drama or a real love story. And the reason I say that's a trap is because a lot of writers, directors, and actors who are really good at creating comedy don't necessarily have the skill set to create a moving, genuinely stirring love story. But I have absolutely no problem with movies that can walk that walk. I mean, if you look at the history of Hollywood, it is littered with comedies that excel as a brilliant comedy as well as a very moving love story. The late 30s and early 40s in particular was the great heyday of those kinds of movies like The Philadelphia Story. And I would argue that the original Groundhog Day pulls that off as well. The love story between Andie MacDowell and Bill Murray absolutely works. And at the very end of the movie, when they do fall in love, it doesn't feel like a betrayal of the tone. It feels earned. It absolutely works for that particular movie. But even if I don't buy the scenes in this movie where it tries to be sincere, where it tries to be heartfelt and earnest and take itself seriously, there is still plenty to be enjoyed. Mostly because Andy Samberg and Cristin Milioti are just absolutely so game, and they have so much charisma, and they absolutely nail the comedic elements. I'm slowly but surely becoming a massive fan of Cristin Milioti. She was really good in Black Mirror. She was incredible in the TV show Fargo. You'll also recognize her from movies like Wolf of Wall Street. Unlike Groundhog Day, where only Bill Murray was stuck in the loop, in Palm Springs, we have three characters that are stuck in the loop. Basically, there's an earthquake out in the desert. It opens up this giant cave, and anybody who walks into this red glowing cave is doomed to be stuck in this perpetual cycle. And what's kind of clever about the movie is how it doesn't really worry that much about the rules. All three of these characters who are stuck in these loops, no matter how they end their particular day, no matter how much they kind of get out of sequence in terms of their timelines, no matter what happens, they're all going to wake up back in the same universe. And the movie doesn't really waste that much time getting too worked up about the physics involved. And I think what I enjoyed most about this movie is how it taps into the dread and misery that a lot of people feel when bearing witness to some of the more superficial ingredients of a wedding. I can be a little bit cynical at times, and weddings tend to bring that out in me because there's nothing more nauseating than listening to a really long wedding toast, whether you're talking about the rehearsal dinner or the wedding night. Also, quick personal note, I think there's a special place in hell for people who require a sit-down dinner after a wedding. After a wedding, you should have drinks, food, dancing, partying, etc. Any toast you want to make them at the rehearsal dinner the night before. But there's some people out there, and you know who you are, that like to do a rehearsal dinner the night before, and they like to do a wedding dinner after the wedding so that the guests get subjected to 2 rounds of toasts. And I'm always of the opinion that when you're making a wedding toast, be brief, be sincere, be seated. Well, we've all been in that situation where there's somebody who thinks they're a lot more entertaining than they actually are. And they start telling some really long, nonsensical story about, oh my God, once upon a time, we were taking algebra and so forgot to do the homework and la 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 la, and using stupid expressions like hashtag life goals. At any rate, what I thought this movie did really well is tapping into just how ridiculous people can be at weddings. I guess I'm coming across as a pretty cynical guy about weddings in general. And I don't want this review to turn into some sort of strange confession about how much I dislike going to weddings. Although, to be fair, in my 20s, I did like going to weddings. They basically turn into a giant college reunion party, and they're a ton of fun. And I think that's where this movie is at its best, is when it's exploring some of the crazy hijinks people get into at weddings, whether you're talking about experimenting with mind-altering substances. There's a particularly good scene with JK Simmons and Andy Samberg just getting absolutely wasted in a bathtub, having this big bonding session. And there are a lot of good scenes about all the screwing around that goes on behind the scenes during a wedding, oftentimes between people who are not supposed to be technically getting it on. But I don't want to give away some of those revelations related to the plot. Point being that there's no shortage of inappropriate hanky-panky from start to finish in this movie. So it definitely gets a gold star on that front. And I like how the movie doesn't fall into the trap of just being yet another predictable, generic kind of frat boy comedy. Because you can make a case for Cristin Milioti being the far more deranged of the 2 stars in terms of how she chooses to spend her time. And the movie does have some decent scenes early on where it gets almost philosophical about what is the meaning of life, and what is the meaning of life if every day is going to be the exact same cycle over and over again. And bringing in JK Simmons was an absolute masterstroke. He's used sparingly in this movie, but he has all these dark, cynical moments like where he says, Confucius said marriage is a bottomless pit of sorrow that makes you forget who you are. And this is the mild spoiler, so if you don't want spoilers, bail out now, but his character gets dragged into this time loop kind of sort of against his will, because his character and Samberg's character, they're so wasted. They're kind of talking about how they don't want this day ever to end. So Samberg, as a gesture of goodwill, drags him into the cave, gets him stuck in the cycle as well. So for the rest of the movie, Simmons is always trying to think of increasingly elaborate ways to kill and or torture Samberg's character as punishment. So for those of you out there who like to have a few drinks and talk about how life is meaningless, I think there's a lot of gallows humor at play in this movie that people will enjoy. And while I'm not quite ready to say that Andy Samberg is going to be my favorite new comedy writer, not by any stretch of the imagination, however, he does write some really funny bits. Like at one point, JK Simmons is hanging out looking at his kids, and he's kind of waxing poetic about the meaning of life. And he looks at his little son and says, little Joey's watering dog shit. That's weird, but it's beautiful. So there is a sweet, tender side to the movie. Probably the sweetest line of the movie at one point is when Andy Samberg's making the pitch for why he thinks that he and Sarah are a perfect match together, because at this point they've been together for thousands of days, and he says, we're already sick of each other. It's the best. So I think for couples looking for a nice rom-com to enjoy together, this movie will absolutely fit the bill. And who knows, maybe some people will find the more sincere ingredients to be more emotionally impactful, just because by that point they'll have fallen in love with the characters. I just have a little bit of a personal bone to pick with comedy writers in general who consistently over and over again fall into this trap. There's actually very few comedies in the world that avoid that trap and stay silly and stay deranged and stay funny from start to finish. If you want to get super old school, a classic like Duck Soup with the Marx Brothers. Or if you want to flash forward to someone like Mel Brooks, movies like The Producers or Young Frankenstein or Blazing Saddles. Or if you want to get into the movies from my childhood, a movie like Airplane, where every time you think it's about to become sincere, it becomes yet another joke. And I guess it's kind of scary for filmmakers to try and walk that tightrope, because formulas exist for a reason, and the rom-com structure is a very easy and reliable structure to fall back on. I just find it very tired. I find it very boring. I find it very safe. I'm much more impressed with a movie like The Big Lebowski, which remains deranged and insane and overflowing with imagination from start to finish. So long story short, I think Palm Springs is perfectly harmless, perfectly enjoyable, kind of forgettable, but worth a watch if you're in the mood for a comedy. Is it as good as Groundhog Day? No. I think Andy Samberg is an absolutely hysterical comedic performer. He's not on the level of Bill Murray. And the filmmaking team behind this movie is absolutely not on the level of Harold Ramis. But they're young, they're just getting started. Who knows? They might end up becoming one of the best comedy duos imaginable. But reviewing comedy is always such a strange thing, because comedy is so subjective. No matter how much you try to explain a joke to somebody or open up a joke for somebody, if they're not laughing already, they're not going to suddenly start by you overanalyzing it. So who knows? Maybe people out there will like this movie more than I did. It's been incredibly well reviewed across the board on Metacritic and Rotten Tomatoes. My taste in comedy tends to veer towards comedy that's much more, it just has a little bit more bite to it. But if you lean toward comedy that's a little bit more like chewing bubblegum, who knows? Palm Springs might be absolutely right up your alley. But I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this review. So if you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell, liking the video. And if you want to talk more about comedy, hunt me down on Twitter @Colbrex. But I hope everyone has an amazing weekend. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.